Thank you for joining us here on the Chris Heasley Show. My name is Nathan Bigelow. Chris is actually out this week for some much-needed vacation, but we definitely have a great episode with you guys. We're going to be talking a lot about what education means to us here today. A lot of different areas. I know it's a hot topic, especially at a federal but now also a local level in regards to the disbanding or the potential disbanding of the Department of Education and what the ramifications are of that. But today we do have Julie with us, so thank you for joining us, Julie.
Yes, good morning, Nathan. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And then also on the line we have G2 with us.
Good afternoon.
Hey, G2, how's it going?
It's going well, thank you.
Good, good. And so today what we're going to talk about real quick is just getting into... Sorry about that. Just getting into the education Department of Education and what that actually means and what the plans for the president are in regards to having that disband at this time. I know that we're having some technical difficulties. Bear with us one moment. There we are. Thank you for that. And then, so we've been hearing a lot around the Department of Education, especially when it comes to President Trump and what it means to him to disband it. Julie, what is your take on
that? First of all, I just want to say, again, thank you for having me on the show. And, I do represent about 10,000 square miles of the great state of Texas, about 2.5 million constituents. I represent District 7. So, yes, the president has been he's been very vocal on the topic of the U.S. Department of Education. He has talked about it at rallies. He has talked about it certainly on social media, on Twitter and Truth Social and what have you. And then also he released through Trump 47 the Agenda Education. And then, of course, that talks about U.S. Department of Education also. But the U.S. Department of Education was created in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter. And so it was a campaign promise to the unions to greatly expand their opportunity to increase the number of union members through teachers and administrators in education. And so of all the executive branch departments, it's probably the youngest, if not one of the youngest. But for us, where we sit today, went into effect in 1979, we've had a couple of generations where the U.S. Department of Education has been very strong as part of the executive branch. And so we are used to having that federal oversight, federal support, federal regulation. So like I said, the President Trump has been very vocal publicly on this issue. And so I think that he has a few options before him. The U.S. Department of Education is part of the executive branch of government. So it fully falls under his purview, but then Congress is who sets aside the funding and the appropriations to fund the department. So it's going to be whichever way the president decides, it's going to be working with Congress to decide the U.S. Department of Education's future. And so, the Secretary of Education fully serves at the will of the president. And like I said, that department is part of the executive branch. So he has said multiple times now that his will is to end the U.S. Department of Education. But it's a very large part of the executive branch and part of course, Education America, right? They provide funding, supports, mandates for education for all 50 states and 6 U.S. territories. So it's going to be, if he chooses to do that after he swears into office January 20th, if he chooses to go down that route of ending the U.S. Department of Education, it's going to take time to dismantle it because you can't just say it's over, right? It would cause instability and chaos, and I don't think that's his will because he's already said that he's going to appoint a wonderful leader, a wonderful woman, Linda McMahon, as Secretary of Education. So if his intent were just to end it on day one, he wouldn't appoint a secretary necessarily. Right. So I think, President Trump is an incredible businessman. Linda McMahon is an incredible businesswoman. And so I think they'll have a great plan in place to end the U.S. Department of Education without creating mass disruptions at the state and local level.
Right. And I know that a moment ago you had mentioned G2. I definitely want to get your opinion on this because one of the major issues that people have in regards to the Department of Education is the allocation of funding, right? And a lot of people really ask the question, what is the purpose of the Department of Education? If they're taking in $268 billion or just over $268 billion a year, but yet only $80 billion of that dollar amount is going towards education, which the large majority of it is actually going towards federal student loans and Pell Grants. So there's only about 6 to 8% of the even $80 billion that goes towards K through 12. And the question then becomes, what is the purpose of the Department of Education? G2?
Well, if you look at their website, the Department of Education likes to even brag about how they use that funding that they do provide, that $80 billion, that they have at their disposal to do a couple of things. One is that they use these things called Dear Colleague letters. These are letters written by the Department of Education and sent out to the education community. And, you know, when I started many years ago saying that the executive branch writes the laws, and people, of course, who'd read the Constitution would say, well, that's not true. The legislature does that. And I would say, well, go look at a Dear Colleague letter and find me a school that doesn't comply. Because if you don't comply with the Department of Education's dictates, then they take away money, they will send in their Civil Rights Division, they will cause you a lot of pain. So whether it's in the Constitution or just in practice, they've been writing laws for a very long time. And that really has to stop. You know, you think about it, at each state, and Julie, you know, this is the second time we got a chance to talk, and I quite enjoyed the first time. I'm glad to be back on the air with you here. But each state has a state board of education. Every school district has a board, and so this is really just a duplicative thing. Now, to the extent that we need to keep these grant programs to fund universities, then I suppose there could be a small administrative organization that simply processes Pell Grant applications and things of that sort. But the main mission of this organization seems to be twofold. One is laundering money from the taxpayer out to their friends, and second is using that money to force behaviors on the schools that the schools would not necessarily undertake on their own. So they use that massive amount of cash they have to override the will of, say, the citizens. So when you hear a local school district and their parents are showing up and complaining about pornography in the schools or policy issues or these crazy curricula like wit and wisdom that are out in the schools today, and the school boards seem to be completely unresponsive to those voters, those parents, it's because in one of the factors is that they're beholden to the Department of Education to keep all this money flowing. So it's just a bad organization. It's a racket, a ideological organization. It should be banished and taken away. If there is some amount of grants that have to be processed, again, a small administrative group could do that. But let's put the education back to the states, back to the local school boards, and most importantly, back to the parents.
Right, and I know that, Julie, we were talking beforehand, I believe, has that same sentiment. What is your reaction?
So G2, I completely agree with where you're going with your train of thought, how you're tracking on this, because, you know, we've seen from the U.S. Department of Education where they set quotas. And so some of those quotas violate even federal law. And I'll give you an example is they may set a quota around LGBTQ plus participation in programs that a school offers or in parent advisory groups that the school district utilizes to advise the school board. And so what happens is those quotas, because the school district or the state receives those federal funds, which is a very small percentage of the overall budget, especially here in the state of Texas, then because they take those funds, then they have to reach those quotas. And so those quotas are not reflective of many of the local ISDs and the values of the state of Texas, but yet we're forced into that. So a couple of things have happened is, first of all, you know, there was a Supreme Court case last year called the Chevron deference case, which that case before the U.S. Supreme Court had to do with, does an executive branch 3-letter agency rulemaking authority supersede federal and state law? And so the Supreme Court came down very firm on this, that the executive branch, what G2 was referring to, that we have 3-letter agencies making law, because in essence, that's what they have been doing. The Supreme Court last year in the Chevron case said no, that a 3-letter agency's rulemaking authority is not law and it does not supersede. And I'll give you an example, is like I said, is in that final round of federal funding after COVID that came through, the Biden administration attached all of those quotas to your local ISDs and to the state of Texas and, all states that took the money. And so, but there's a federal law called the Pupil Protection Information Act that says you're not allowed, by federal law, you're not allowed to ask a student their sexual orientation or their political beliefs. There's a whole list of things that no one associated with the school district is allowed to survey, test, or ask a student. And so that it could easily be said that the U.S. Department of Education, through that ESSER funding, the quotas they had to meet for student populations represented in programs, that you would violate federal law by asking the student those questions to see who even qualifies. So that's where the U.S. Supreme Court Chevron case was so valuable. I think that case specifically was surrounding ESGs, maybe oil and gas, but it applies to all 3-letter executive branch agencies. So yes, G2, to your point there. And then, like you're saying, it's 6 to 8%. I was a school board trustee when the Obama administration first sent out letters to school districts in Texas saying that, it was in the early part of 2016, saying that in order to maintain our federal funding, that we had to make all of our restrooms and locker rooms gender neutral. Well, for the school district that I was serving at the time, that clearly violated the will of the people. That clearly violated the will of the parents and the constituents of the school district that I was serving as a trustee at the time. And so we went into a budget meeting and figured out that at that time, this was before COVID, that the federal funding of our school district was sitting around 3%. So 3% of a budget, you can make up, you tighten your belt a little bit, you can make that up pretty easily. So we sent our own letter back to the White House saying that thank you for your interest in our school district, but that doesn't fit our community standards, so no thank you. But again, it's just a lot of bullying. That's what we've seen out of the U.S. Department of Education and around the Office of Civil Rights and the DOE. It's just a lot of threats and a lot of bullying of state and local governments. And, as conservatives, we firmly believe in the power of local government and the state. As conservatives, we don't like the federal government coming in and telling us a lot of times what to do with our children and what to do with our communities.
Right, and going back to the sentiment around funding, I know a lot of people, especially parents within the special education area, are really worried about the disbanding of the Department of Education because a lot of the funding comes through Title I. And when you try and go into the numbers around, how much each state is actually getting from the federal government, when in reality property taxes, lottery taxes, depending on which state you're on, is actually what pays the majority of it. However, they're still not understanding those aspects and worried about how those programs are still going to be funded. So have you heard or do you have an idea around, calming those issues?
Yes, so like I said, it's a very small percentage, first of all, okay, around Title I. So right now, like I said, the Secretary of Education and the Department of Education serves at the will of the President of the United States. President Trump, where he has said that he wants to end the U.S. Department of Education, at this point, he has not laid out a comprehensive plan of what that actually looks like for his administration. I mean, we're still in the transition phase. Right. But I expect Secretary McMahon will release that plan. And so, he has a lot of options before him. Anything from completely ending the U.S. Department of Education to maybe scaling it down to just back to where kind of it started, kind of bare bones, right? Special education and food and nutrition programs. So, he's a great leader and a very smart president and businessman. And Linda, Secretary McMahon, she'll be fantastic leaders. So I'm sure they'll release a plan, but at the same time, at the state and local level, you need to listen to what the president has been saying now for several months and read his agenda in education to understand where his intent of where he wants to go. So I think at the state and local level, we should be making plans about how to fund special education properly and provide for the needs of special education students. So at the Texas State Board of Education, we just voted on legislative priorities, and that was one of our priorities, to increase special education funding. So, because I think if you're listening to what's happening at the federal level and even, the voters, the president won the popular vote as well as the electoral college. So when you listen to the mandate of Americans, the mandate from the people in the state of Texas of what they want all of education. They want special education and all of education to fall under state and local control. And Texas is ready to lead that. We just completely redid and implemented a special education advisory booklet for every school district in the state around dyslexia and autism. So we are fully capable of handling the needs of special education students in the state of Texas, just like every other state is. But those budgetary conversations need to start happening about fully funding it, and then also putting in together comprehensive guidance for your local ISDs on the for inclusion for special education students into education, and then also for accommodating all of their needs.
Right, absolutely. And G2, I want to pose the same question to you, or if you want to elaborate on anything that Julia said here.
Well, so Julie, you've made a huge number of really important points, and these are more important because of what you said, Nathan. The American public doesn't really understand this. They think, I believe that most people think the Department of Education runs schools, that they educate children. They do none of that. And so when they're afraid of it going away, they're afraid because they misunderstand its purpose and its actual real function, right? They don't realize it's just the money processing center with huge numbers of bureaucrats that are pushing their own ideology upon the states and the school districts. So if they were aware of that, I think opinions would change quickly. I'll tell you, when I first heard, I think it was Ted Cruz say the Department of Education should be eliminated, I thought he was being silly. I thought it was just a radical point to get clicks on the internet. And then I looked into the Department of Education more carefully and realized that he was exactly right. It should never have been created. There is a very direct correlation between the decline in the performance of American schools and the creation and then growth in power and budget of the U.S. Department of Education. Since it has been created, our schools nationally have gone from maybe the most competitive in the world, certainly among the top, to not near the top. We've gone from educating our children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, as they used to say, to instead educating them in sexuality and exploration of their gender identity and all this woke ideology. And what's happening is we're graduating kids who just don't have the skills to move the nation forward. So this is a disaster for them. It's a disaster for the nation. So you touched on Chevron for a minute. I just want to highlight that. So the Chevron decision, as it was originally written, was a terrible decision and said that if a court has a question about something that the agency involved has expertise in, education, energy, whatever, that the court will defer to that agency for expertise. And as a result, these agencies would get taken into court by citizens or companies, and they never had to defend their position. They simply had to say, this is our position. The other side sort of had the burden of proof. Chevron changed all of that, and to your point said that these federal agencies can't continue to behave as if they're writing law. This is one of the major moves that's happened in recent years to reinstate our U.S. Constitution and return us to a constitutional representative form of government, because we have not been there. Our Constitution has been severely damaged. So you made some great points there. And one last thought. When you say that it's a small amount of funding, and I know that's true because I've looked at funding for schools in Texas, it's a small amount of funding that the Department of Education actually gives these schools. But with those funding and with those Dear Colleague letters comes a lot of expense, reporting burdens, hiring administrators, When you look at the growth in expense over the last decade in schools, colleges, and K-12, you see that growth in administrators outstrips teachers. It outstrips the growth in student population. It's become an incredibly bureaucratized, expensive system that's not delivering value. So when you look at that funding and you say, it's easy to offset it, well, I think sometimes if you just unravel what the Department of Education is forcing schools to do, eliminate those administrative positions, shrink their bureaucracy, they can offset just by doing that a lot of the funds they lose if they refuse to comply with these ridiculous ideological dictates coming from the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
Right. And, going back to what you were saying in regards to the Department of Education since its installation, the decline in the education and performance of our students, it's actually a statistic that you can look up as well, that 1 in 5, or around 20% of all adults, are illiterate here in America, which means that 20% of our population has the inability to read and write at a functional level. When you look at graduating students at this point in time, it's even worse. The number is dramatically changed into I think it's a little over 30% of graduating students, which is concerning because, first of all, how are they graduating without having the ability to even read or write properly? But it goes into a lot of different areas, like how the effects of, Department of Education, I know that you wanted to talk on, Julie, was its effects on Title IX. So you want to go into that?
Sure, because, like I said, let's look a little bit about how the funding mechanism has gone for the U.S. Department of Education kind of over the last few decades. Is the Department of Education used to fund states and local ISDs with what's called block grants. And these block grants would center around workforce development, literacy, around specific subjects. But they just came as a source of funding, and then the state could decide what was the best way to apply it within their local ISDs at the state level or local level. Well, that radically changed in 2016 with the Obama administration, the Obama-Biden administration, because now we weren't just simply in a block grant funding formula. Now you received your funding, but you received, a 100-page contract to go with it, right, with all of these quotas and requirements. And like I said, requirements that even could potentially violate federal law. So that was the big shift that we saw. And when that shift happened, at least in my circles, we started referring to it as the Department of Indoctrination. Because now if you're going to qualify a child to participate in a UIL event or in a AP course because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, now you need to ask them, what is that? Well, children don't naturally think about 28 different genders, right? So now you have to educate children on what are 28 different genders so they can pick what gender they are, so that now that you can put them into a program according to that to fulfill the federal government's requirement on a grant. So this is where they really shifted to become the Department of Indoctrination instead of the Department of Education, because you only have so many minutes a day to educate a child. And if you're spending those minutes, like I said, on teaching them 28 different genders and not teaching them how to read and write and comprehension and phonics and science of reading and math, right? Math scores are abysmal across the country right now, including in Texas, right? Because whenever we saw Common Core standards implemented again under the Obama-Biden administration, when we saw Common Core standards implemented in math, we have just seen a steady decline of math scoring in America and in Texas, right? I mean, this is a nationwide problem. And then whenever COVID happened, well, COVID just hit the gas pedal on that decline. I mean, where it was just kind of a slow and steady decline, COVID drove it off the cliff. So we really need to reevaluate education as a whole from our standards, definitely removing Common Core standards, looking at Department of Education, back to the U.S. Department of Education, and then also looking at our advanced placement courses that are put out by College Board, which also align with U.S. Department of Education with their agenda and what they are doing. So we need to take a hard look at education. But the great thing is, if President Trump does go ahead in the U.S. Department of Education, that is going to make the states and the local government a lot more powerful in education, because you won't have the DOE with their quotas and their contracts and their bullying through their Office of Civil Rights. They use their Office of Civil Rights to threaten school districts all the time, and to forcing them for the local school districts that the parents don't agree with the woke indoctrination, where the parents say, look, I'm electing school board trustees because I don't want my children to be indoctrinated. I want my children to receive a great education that's going to prepare them to live the American dream, to be a well-educated population according to the Texas Constitution. But yet these trustees, they feel so hamstrung because at the same time they have the club hanging over them from the U.S. Department of Education, constant threat to do things DC's way. So we're going to have a new day in education starting in 2025. And so I hope that we use that, because such as Title IX, the Biden administration put out a new definition for Title IX, which, for anyone that doesn't know, Title IX is what protects your females in all UIL events. It's what says that, that girls can have their own sports, girls can have their own competitions, separate of men, separate of males, because just naturally, biologically speaking, men are faster, they're stronger, they have more stamina, and so it just to create an equal playing field, Title IX created a separate competition just for females. Well, then we have again the Biden-Harris administration coming back and expanding the Title IX definition to include males. Because now if you have a male that sexually identifies as a female, well, then now they're saying you have to allow them. You have to allow them, if you're to participate in the girls' choir. And if your girls' choir goes on an overnight trip to a competition, well, now that male who identifies as a female is now staying in the hotel with your daughters and your granddaughters because they identify as a female. So this radical left Title IX expansion, which, by the way, the United States Supreme Court has struck down, but the U.S. Department of Education has not removed it yet from their instructions to our state and local school boards. So you'll still see it in your local board policy. It'll say U.S. Department of Education, Department of Civil Rights recommends that you recognize sexual orientation and gender identity when considering your Title IX for your female students in your school district. And so we're still seeing that recommendation coming down, even though the Fifth Circuit Federal Court, which is over Texas, has struck it down, and the U.S. Supreme Court has struck it down. So, yes, there's a lot of great things that are going to happen whenever you don't have that constant threat on our school board trustees and on our states, a threat of lawsuit, threat of accreditation. There's many ways they can threaten a school district now to force compliance into their woke indoctrination.
Right, absolutely. So I want to throw that back to you, G2, in regards to the Title IX and its effects.
Well, this plan that Biden had was so terrible, and Julie, you explained exactly why. Suddenly girls are competing with boys in all manner of sports, which in some cases leads to injury. They're just different body masses, different strengths. It's just not. There's a reason why women's sports and girls' sports were created, and so the Biden administration takes that as one more tool to advance their radical ideology. And it really is like a religion, this idea that they want all children in all the schools across the nation talking to their teachers, talking to school administrators about sexuality and about exploring their sexual habits and teaching them the most aggressive things. And in many cases, and I know Texas has a law now that protects schools, but in most states there is no law that keeps pornography out of schools. In fact, it's the other way around. The law says if you have pornography in a school, it's for educational purposes, it's okay. And so, this ideology, this religion, this bizarre thinking that's been pushed into these schools across the country caused so much reaction from parents that people may not remember this, but the Department of Justice, which also has an aggressive civil rights division, put parents going to school boards to complain about porn, to complain about these really bad curricula that aren't teaching reading or writing, science and math. They listed them as domestic terrorists, as one of the greatest threats to the nation, and one of the terror updates that the Department of Justice issues from time to time. So this has gone so far out of line, and this Department of Education is a core operation to drive the ideology. So what do you have here? You have an organization who, since its inception and its growing involvement in your daily school life, has driven the results that American schools are delivering down, has worsened the education our kids are getting. It sucks up tens of billions. $85 billion was the last budget I saw for the Department of Education. Remember, before the war in Ukraine, Russia, a world military power, had a $65 billion defense budget. These people don't run a school, don't teach a kid, and they've got a bigger budget than Russia's military budget. It puts it in perspective. So its purpose is to suck money out of the federal government and use it to advance its agenda. And then, of course, its mission is to use that civil rights group to go out and advance that agenda even more aggressively, because if you do not bend the knee to a Dear Colleague letter or to a dictate from the Department of Education, they will come and, as you said, Julie, they'll come out to your school district. And when you've got a civil rights division from a federal agency coming to your school district and calling out administrators and maybe school board members and calling them bigots and saying that they're transphobic or that they are just bad people, the public doesn't follow this stuff closely enough to know what's going on. They believe often that the federal government is coming out there to sort of represent the people's best interests. They really don't understand the way this ideology has gripped that organization. So, I'm glad that this Title IX thing is getting so much resistance. Early on, a group called Moms for Liberty got a stay order that said that if anybody at any school that Moms for Liberty has students in, they cannot implement the Title IX change that the Biden administration put in place. So here's a citizens group that rose up, took aggressive action to fight back, and again, as a result, they ended up on a terror watch list. It's just showing you how far we've gotten away from the Constitution. So I'm very excited. I agree with you that Linda McMahon is a great choice. This is not someone who's deeply embedded in the industry, so she doesn't have all the industry connections to the book publishers, the curricula publishers, to the unions. She's an independent person. She's extremely smart, got great background, and she's not looking for a career here. She's looking to have an impact on our education system to make it better. And, Julie, you mentioned the Trump Force 47, or rather Trump Agenda 47 agenda for schools. And if you go down and read what Trump wants to install, it's the stuff that is of common sense. It's what every parent would want, including school choice. So if you do have a school board that's radicalized, if you do have a teacher that's radicalized, if the school that your kids are going to is failing, you might have the option of taking your children out. Most Americans, as a practical matter, as a financial matter, do not have the option of taking their kids out of their public school at this time. They just don't, because they have to fund a private school while continuing to pay their taxes for the public school. It just doesn't work. They can't move from one district to another. It's not practical. So implementing those programs that give parents choices, just like we have choices in selecting who we buy TVs from, which brand of computer we buy, whether we go to one service provider or another, there's no reason that the union-controlled public schools should not be facing the same kind of competition. Now, that's my perspective. I recognize, Julie, you may have a different one. But I will say, your grasp of these issues and the way you are focused on real education and not the radical ideology makes you a valuable asset at the Texas School Board. I will tell you that I'm not sure that that there's one of you at other states' school boards. I'm sure many do, but when you see the policies coming out of the states, I think many times you see that maybe there's no Julie Pickering sitting on those state school boards speaking for the parents and the students.
Right, and so, talking about curriculum and Texas particularly, so my wife is actually an individual that advocates for homeschooling, and I know that is a growing thing here in the state of Texas, and it has to do with a lot of the times parents not trusting the schools in regards to their curriculum specifically. I know for my girls, that's exactly why my wife doesn't allow them to go to any particular school right now. Now, I hope to make that change in the area that I am and in getting involved, but when it comes to satisfying these parents in regards to their uneasiness around curriculum, I know Texas has recently made a change into the Blue Bonnet curriculum. Can you expound a little bit on that, Julie?
I can, because kind of going back to the U.S. Department of Education is, you have these very large publishers in America that publish instructional materials for the vast majority of states. I mean, these are huge publishing houses that have been around for decades, publishing instructional materials for schools. And I feel like these publishers have kind of been caught in this kind of quagmire and kind of this no man's land, because you have states similar to Texas, but I don't think as strong as we've been leading on this subject. Texas has really been taking point on this, of passing great laws that say you will include patriotism in all core subjects, kindergarten through 12th grade. There will be a theme of America is exceptional, Texas is great, and throughout your instructional materials. We have laws that say you cannot have obscenity and pornography in your instructional materials. We have laws that say that you cannot have critical race theory in your instructional materials, right? You can't teach a little child, you can't teach a second grader that because of the color of their skin, they're an oppressor, and heap all of those negative emotions onto them, guilt, shame, frustration, anger, and then tell another child because of the color of their skin. I'm talking little children where this starts. So this isn't a high school thing, right? It is in high schools also, but starting with little children. And then telling another set of little children that because of their color of their skin, that they're a victim, that the U.S. Constitution, the entire systems in America, the state, local government is naturally built against them. So therefore, they'll never have a hope and a future in America, which we know clearly is not true just by the number of people that we have immigrating to America every day to be able to have a chance to live the American dream. It's totally contrary to our founding documents that says that Declaration of Independence, that we as a nation believe that all men are created equal. That we have a creator and that we were created equal. So these national publishers have been in this quagmire because the state of Texas has so many wonderful laws, but yet the U.S. Department of Education has their standards, which do not comply with Texas state law, Texas Constitution, and even the U.S. Constitution. So that's the problem these national publishers have. So then getting them, if viewers probably don't know, but Texas, we're kind of vacillating back and forth with California with having the most amount of children in public education. But the big difference for if you are going into a contract with the state, if you are a corporation, a national publisher going into contract with the state, is Governor Abbott has created the finest Texas economy we've ever had. Texas now, our last legislative session, and I believe going to the next legislative session, the comptroller has announced we have these huge surpluses in our budget. The Texas economy is booming because of great policies set by our legislature and our governor and our lieutenant governor. But whereas California, people can't leave fast enough. Honestly, I mean, I think I read an article that said that U-Haul now charges a higher fine or a higher fee, not a fine, but a fee if you're leaving California one way. Right. So California, I believe I was reading, California now is a $70 billion deficit, budget deficit in the whole, whereas Texas is posting billions of dollars in additional revenue, right? So that's surplus, thank you, surplus. So that's just the huge difference between the two states. So now if I'm a national publisher that's going to enter into multi-million-dollar contracts with the state or local governments, I'm probably not going to write for the state that has the $70 billion deficit that maybe I get paid. When do I get paid? Is it on terms? Is it not? I'm probably going to write for the state that has also the most amount of children in public education that is flushed with cash, right? That can pay their bills and honor their contracts and pay their contracts on time. So, but like I said, the state law in Texas, our legislature and lieutenant governor and governor have been doing such a fantastic job of protecting children in Texas from the woke indoctrination, right? As Elon says, the woke mind virus. They have been working so diligently for years to protect our children and to provide a high quality education that has been just polar opposite of what's been coming out of our U.S. Department of Education. So the publishers, I'll give you an example. Last November, whenever we were adopting science textbooks, there was so much in that was violating what Texas wants and what our state law and Texas Constitution says, that there were over 30,000 edits that had to be made to the science textbooks to make them compliant with what Texas parents want and what Texas has said, how we want our children to be educated, to not be indoctrinated. So what happened was last legislative session, for the very first time, I believe, in the history of our country, the Texas legislature passed House Bill 1605. Governor Abbott signed it into law, and for the very first time, a state is now a publisher of instructional materials. So now Texas developed, wrote, and published the Texas Bluebonnet materials, which do honor all of our state laws. No critical race theory, no pornography, no obscenities, high quality, the return to academic rigor. So people aren't really talking about what's happened with academic rigor, but because I've been elected so long in education, I have seen this transition happen with the dropping of the standards, the dropping of the education level. You know, whenever I was first elected a trustee, compared to where we are now, what was considered general education, right? Just your general population or general education, general students. That's now what we're seeing in a lot of AP courses and a lot of advanced courses. And so just the decline of the academic rigor has been astounding over the last decade or so. So the Bluebonnet materials return that academic rigor to the classroom. Another great thing about the Bluebonnet materials, other than, like I said, following the Texas Constitution, U.S. Constitution, Texas state laws, is that it puts the teacher back at the center of the classroom, because so many of the instructional materials that are coming before the states now to approve for the local ISDs, they're completely online. So when you have a student on a device, on a tablet or on a device all day long, well, now you have relegated your teacher to a facilitator, because now the device is teaching the student. So one of the things that I love about the new Bluebonnet instructional materials is that they are in pencil and paper form. They are in workbook form, because we really do have fantastic teachers. You know, there's a few teachers, there's some one-offs here and there, teachers doing bad things, but for the most part, I mean, teachers in our community are the cream of the crop. They're moms, they're dads, they're highly respected members of the community. They've gone through extensive background checking. They've gone through extensive training. And so what I love about the Bluebonnet materials is that now when you go back to paper form, now the instruction is happening between the teacher and the student, and the conversations and the dialogue and the questions and the critical thinking now that can happen inside of a classroom that we have been missing for several years because children being put on devices all day. And then another great piece of the Bluebonnet is that it goes back to teaching children cursive. Now, that may not sound like much to people, but there's two very important reasons why you want children to learn cursive. Number one, it has to do with whole brain development. It's just even the friction of the pencil on the paper and the learning to writing cursive. It is great for brain development. And the second reason is that all of our founding documents are written in cursive. And so if you go 2, 3, 4 generations of nobody learning cursive, now you're going to have an entire an American population, a Texas population, that's going to have to rely on AI or somebody that can read and write cursive to interpret founding documents. Well, I don't know about you. We went through a time in history where the Bible had to be interpreted for folks, and it didn't go so well. Right. It's best when people can read things, when people can read founding documents for themselves and teach their children and teach their families from primary source documents. And so there's a just really great reason. So the new Bluebonnet materials do go back to teaching children how to write in cursive.
Right. And you know, I've been listening and hearing a little bit about the Bluebonnet. One of the primary issues that people might have with it is that it does seem that it's more of a faith-based curriculum. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do know that people have mentioned that they might have some issue with that. Are these more of like an opt-in, opt-out kind of situation?
Yes. So, you know, we heard Probably between all of our meetings on the Texas State Board of Education, we heard well over 20 hours of testimony on this, for support, people commenting on all of the instructional materials that came through our process for adoption. But a large number of the comments were based on the new Bluebonnet materials, just because it's the first time it's ever been done. And there's a Texas state law that says that you will use the Bible for instructional text when it relates to culture and history. And so there's not faith being presented. There's not a religion being presented. What's being presented is, for example, in elementary, whenever we're teaching how to write letters, there's a unit on civil rights, because in my estimation, and in a lot of people's estimation, one of the finest letters ever written was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, right? When Dr. King was arrested and he's sitting in that Birmingham jail, and he wrote a letter, and in that letter he references how he's feeling, right, what his emotional state is, and he references feeling like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Daniel in the lion's den, the fiery furnace. That's how he's relating. Well, unless you have the cultural knowledge of what is Daniel in the lion's den, what is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what are those stories, then there's no way to understand how Dr. King was feeling sitting in that Birmingham jail. So that's where it's important, and that's just one instance where it's culturally and historically correct to bring in a lesson from the Old Testament and the New Testament, so students understand. The other place is great works of Western literature. In Texas, for example, or in civics training, in Texas we have the Good Samaritan law. Well, unless you know the story of the Good Samaritan, how are you even going to understand that law in the state of Texas? Also in the state of Texas, like several other states, we have the Baby Moses law. How do you understand the Baby Moses law if you don't understand the story of Moses from the Old Testament? So so much in founding documents, in culture, in Western literature, in our great civil rights movement, draws inference and reference from the Old Testament and the New Testament that really you cannot give kids, you can't give your future population, our current students, the proper knowledge that they need to understand their own society unless you use the Old Testament and the New Testament for cultural and historical reference. So the Bluebonnet materials are not mandatory for anybody. What the state of Texas did do, however, is for the local school districts, the viewers probably should know that your local school districts, on a national average right now, the cost for instructional materials is about $300 per student. So it is millions of dollars that your local school districts and your states are spending on instructional materials. If you go statewide, it goes into the billions, but at the local level, it's millions of dollars. And so what the state of Texas did is, we're very thankful for this booming economy that we have. So we were able to publish it as an open education resource, which means that it's free. Anybody, any school district, any private school, any homeschool, any state, we're not limiting it just to the state of Texas, any state, they are more than welcome to use the Bluebonnet instructional materials. They are completely free. And then, again, because of our great leadership in our state that had the forethought to say we're going to be publishing workbooks, we probably should start looking at, buying paper and publishing cost or whatever. The great state of Texas, it was announced at our last Texas State Board of Education meeting that whenever we print these materials, when Texas prints these materials, it's going to be around $18 per student. So that is a huge that's a huge win for everybody. But then the state also came back and said any school district that wants to use these materials, they are going, not only is it going to be free to the school district, but we are also going to incentivize it. We're going to pay the school district $60 per student. So whenever you have an $18 printing cost, that means that the school districts will net an additional $42 per student if they use the Bluebonnet materials, which are a high quality instructional material. They teach the methodology. They teach science of reading, which is phonics based, which has been missing from a lot of our school districts for too long.
Absolutely.
And so now it's free. So this is a huge win even for the taxpayers at the local level, because they're going to save $1 million on buying the instructional materials because now it's free, and they're going to get an additional $42 per student inside the state of Texas. And then also the state went further. It said, well, what about our teachers? The teachers have been used to, instructional coaches and teachers have been used to teaching with this former material. So the state even went further, and it provided millions in dollars of professional development for any school district that wants to adopt the Bluebonnet materials. Then the state is also going to pay for the professional development of the teachers, because too many of our teachers, especially our newer teachers, they've never taught in phonics style. They've never taught in science of reading style. They've taught in a manner called 3Qing, which 3Qing is now illegal. By state law is illegal in the state of Texas, because if you teach 3Qing wrong to a elementary student, to a new reader, you will cause dyslexia in that child. And so Texas banned it, but we have a lot of teachers, especially newer teachers, who have been educated to only instruct in the model of 3Qing and not phonics. So the state has come along and said, anybody that wants to use Bluebonnet, we will also provide professional development for your teachers.
Well, that's always great to, have better education along with saving a little bit of money.
That's right.
Moving
the
into
Texas way.
Yeah, moving into probably our last part. I know a lot of parents that I've talked to are more worried about not only the curriculum and what's being taught, but also the lack of opportunity for students in schools as well, like more of the skilled trades. There's this mantra of, oh, you have to go to college to be successful. Well, a lot of people I know, and me personally know, that that's just not the case. So the opportunity to have, skilled trades and things put back into the school system that seems to be missing is kind of a question mark. So G2, what would be your take in regards to how schools should approach bringing those back into the school system?
Well, first of all, this ties directly into what Julie just said. The idea of going back to paper and pencil will be met by many parents as a step backward because you're walking away from technology. It's actually quite easy to learn to use a word processor or a spreadsheet or something else if you've already been trained how to think. And if you look at, reporting on what these paper-based or pencil-based, book-based systems give you, you get better focus, you get better retention. You could study longer periods of time than you can when these students are all crammed into a screen, which is a very small environment. You have to fit everything into these small screens rather than maybe a circumstance where you're doing research and you might have a paper out and a couple of books. So I think that is actually a step toward a better education. The use of technology is not something we have to worry about our kids being able to do. So that's great. One quick point on curriculum. This Common Core that you mentioned was basically a dictate from the government, and you didn't have the option to say no. Bluebonnet is a much different approach and sounds like a great idea. I don't know much about it, but it sounds like a fabulous idea, and I like the way it is, and certainly the cost. If you look at these online costs, I mentioned Wit and Wisdom, it may be one of the most expensive curricula you could buy in the country today, and it is a very significant multiple of the cost of what you described with Bluebonnet. So that's great news. But remember this, when Common Core was put into place, a company called Pearson Publishing was given a $350 million grant by the Obama administration to create Common Core curricula. $350 million. You could have built at that time an automotive plant for that, a steel plant for that. You could have built any number of different kinds of businesses for that. It's a massive amount of money. Incomprehensible they would need that to create a curriculum. But then later, when Obama retired from the White House, when he left office, a company called, what was it? It was Penguin, I think. Penguin Random House wrote him a $65 million advance on a book. They couldn't possibly have earned enough money to pay him $65 million. So he got from the company that he gave a $350 million grant to a $65 million commission. And the outcome of that was Common Core, which drove our learning down as a nation. So that's a disaster. Now, coming back to your question, Nate, this idea of putting shop class back in schools, now I've got a different take than most people. I think it's more important that kids learn how to make things out of wood and steel than it is that they learn how to play the violin, because it's a very small number of people that will play the violin or the guitar as a profession. But everyone who needs to learn basic fundamental problem solving, basic sort of physical activity that's not screen based, benefits from shop class, from mechanical drawing classes. And I'm not talking about CAD CAM. I mean on paper again. Go to CAD CAM after you've learned to do it on paper. It's actually fun. Welding is a critical skill. Metal bending, riveting, all those skills help people learn not just the actual application, but also problem solving. And what we're finding is that kids that are coming out now, having never seen a screwdriver, having never touched a wrench or drilled a hole, there's just a fundamental inability sometimes to solve problems if they can't simply touch an app. And I think that's a real problem for employers. It's a problem for families who, now are dependent upon everyone else to fix the simplest thing in a home. It's a weakening of the culture. And of course, in a country that has exported many of its critical industries, we exported with that our critical skills. So it used to be that if you had these skills, you could go out and get a job right away, and it still is in many cases, but we just don't have, there are certain skills that we've lost because we've exported it, and the kids aren't learning the fundamentals in school. I think it's a great idea to do it. They should put shop classes back in these schools, and they should do it immediately. And I think for those that are already out in the workforce, we should have a strong focus on these sort of trade schools, community colleges and trade schools that can help supplement their skills that they may have missed when they spent 12 years in school pounding on an iPhone.
Right. And Julia, when it comes to the state of Texas, do they have any plans to implement any kind of like reinforcement for schools to re-implement these at a larger scale? Because I'm seeing some schools where they have, like where I come from, the Lamar district, they have a separate building that's across town, supposedly, for these children to go to. So it makes it hard for them to even get to it. So a lot of them really opt out of it.
Sure. So looking forward, yes, the state of Texas is very involved in what's called CTE programs, career and technical education. And so the State Board of Education does approve those standards for those programs and instructional materials that follow those standards. But looking forward, I think that workforce development and AP, that's two areas that really looking forward that we really need to drill down on and really look at. Workforce development, yes, absolutely. I attended a meeting with, the Federal Reserve Bank. One of the things that they do is they do projections, job projections 20 years out, who are the top earners, what sectors of society, what parts of the country. And so I attended a meeting with the Federal Reserve where they were talking about I believe it was the chair of the Dallas Federal Reserve who was presenting at this meeting. And so what they were talking about was that the top two earners in the future are going to be neurosurgeons and plumbers, because the average age of a plumber right now in America is around 58, 59 years old. So when you think of potential, or we think of earning potential, it's not just students who go to college, right? Mm-hmm. It's across all sectors of society. We're seeing great developments in energy that's going to require a trained labor force. So yes, we definitely need to look at, that was really a mantra in the 80s with No Child Left Behind, and into the 90s that every child needs to go to college. And that's just a lie. It's a lie that we told our children. It's a lie they bought into. And unfortunately now we have many young Americans that are just saddled with a lot of college debt that are not in the jobs that probably God created them to be in, and that probably aren't making the money that they should be earning if they would have chose a workforce path. But at the same time, we really need to use a lot of wisdom in this space, because we don't want to fall into the slippery slope of pigeonholing children when they're young to say, oh, you're not really college bound, let's put you into a workforce program. Because some children, just like in sports and in fine arts and in other academic areas, some children are just late bloomers, and some children where they might get labeled, oh, you should go into a workforce development program, when maybe academically they're just a late bloomer. So we need to use a lot of wisdom in this space, that we do provide all options for children, but that at the same time that we don't pigeonhole children and label them either way, right? Saying you're only college bound or you're only workforce bound, to where children truly, where we provide them a great education where they can make the choice on how they live the American dream. But the other area that we really need to focus on is what's called our advanced placement courses in high school. Because right now there's an institution called College Board, which the man who created Common Core for the Obama administration is now the president of College Board. And College Board is who represents roughly, this is a kind of a generality, but it's your AP courses in high school. So roughly your top 10% students are who are enrolled in this. But, you know, in the education circles, we speak of this top 10% group as America's Brain Trust or Texas's Brain Trust, right? These are going to be your top 10% students who are college bound, who will become your doctors, lawyers, engineers, presidents, governors, leaders, elected officials. And so when you think about who the College Board is and that they are educating the top 10% students in America, they are a very woke organization. You know, they opposed Texas's critical race theory ban. They opposed a lot of our what we consider traditional values. And then also you have to look at who is the College Board. And so the College Board was started a long time ago. It is a private corporation that was founded out of the New York State Board of Education. So as a very proud Texan who serves on the Texas State Board of Education, I firmly believe we need to take these reins back on who is training or who is educating our top 10%, Texas's Brain Trust, because I firmly believe that Texans and the Texas State Board of Education is much more in tune with parents' values, with our voters' values, with the mandates that we receive from our voters, with the direction of Texas. We are far better equipped and prepared to educate the top 10% students in Texas than the New York State Board of Education. And so I think this is something we really need to take a hard look at, because the College Board has gone down this path of the woke mind virus, of the woke indoctrination. I'll give you an example. In the AP U.S. History course, they use a textbook. It's in the syllabus. Anybody can go to their website and read it today. It's in the syllabus that they use a textbook called A People's Review of U.S. History. Now, keep this in mind. This is the top 10%. This is our brain trust. This is a U.S. history course. And the author of that textbook is an avowed communist. He was a member of the United States Communist Party. He was a leader in the Communist Party in the United States in the 60s and 70s. And so that's where College Board is at now. Where College Board is at now is they're actually using a communist textbook to teach our brain trust, our top 10% students, about U.S. history. So I think as a state, and I think other states, and maybe as a nation, we need to look at what the woke indoctrination that's happening on America's Brain Trust and Texas Brain Trust. But again, Texas, like in a lot of areas, Texas is ready to lead on this issue.
Absolutely. And, you know, today is one of those days where it's just, you know, parents are just so engulfed with their children's education and worried about what the curriculum is and how the future of education is going to take, you know, their children into the future, because in all reality, children are our future. If we're not investing into our children, we're not investing into the furtherment of our society and the furtherment of just life in general. So definitely thank you guys for coming in. G2, thank you for calling in. Julie, you've been a wealth of knowledge. Same to you, GT. And we want to thank Radio Dabang for allowing us to come together and hopefully help you parents feel a little bit more comfortable with a lot of the different areas, a lot of different questions that they might have. But then also we want to thank Chris Heasley for allowing us to come into the show today and just really give our thoughts and understanding to help people feel more comfortable about the direction that not only our nation but also Texas is going into. So I want to give you guys one final second to give any kind of final thought on it. G2?
Well, I'm excited to hear all the things that are happening in Texas, because what I see in other states is not at that level. And while it's exciting because you are clearly on the leading edge of improving education and getting back to educating our students, we still have to be vigilant, because there's always that leftist ideology, that woke religion that's always working to regain control. So I appreciate what you're doing, Julie, and your colleagues. and I just applaud that you keep pushing. Thank you.
Thank you, G2. It's great to hear from you again. I would just like to say, if you would like to keep up with what I'm working on and what I'm doing, go to my website. It's www.juliepickren.com. My name, JULIEPICKREN, juliepickren.com. Excuse me. You can sign up for my newsletter there. And then if you would like to partner with me, you can certainly sign up to donate to the campaign. I would like to stay in elected office and, representing my district and leading for the great state of Texas. So if you just want to hear more about our great victories and our great wins and how SBOE District 7 is ready to lead, please go to juliepickren.com and sign up for the newsletter, and please consider partnering with me. And I just want to say, God bless you. God bless Texas.
Absolutely, and definitely reach out to them if you guys want some more information. Go to her website. But again, thank you, Julie. Thank you, GT, for coming in, and then also thank you to Chris while he's out. Hopefully, he travels safe, and then also to Radio Dabang 99.5 FM. Tune in next time.